climbing to my old. I'm gonna kind of compartmentalize this. I don't know if I'm gonna do the whole thing today, but I'll maybe show you some of the easier things I think first, and then I'll come back and try to show you some of the more difficult ones. All right. The way I usually always encourage you guys to deal with this is by starting at the heart and then kind of having a pattern, having a system, because that's going to become key. Here you have the aorta coming from the heart. All right, can y'all kind of see maybe?
No.
Yeah, I don't know how to. Like I said, I'll step out the way. Y'all can move in, scrunch in as much as possible. Create those little windows. It might work better. I don't know if y'all stand side, like turn that way. That might create a little bit more space, but this is going to be a little harder for you guys down here to see because the heart kind of gets in the way, okay? But you got the arch of the aorta. If you look really closely, like I kind of told you guys last week, there are 3 branches off that arch. 1, and then there's 2, and then there's 3, okay? The first one is always the brachiocephalic trunk. It's between my fingers. It goes off to the right side. So notice how this person's head is turned to the left. This would be his right. So it goes off to the right side, and it gets its name because it's going to supply the right upper extremity. That's the brachial part, brachio rather. And then cephalic because it goes to the head and neck as well. We'll get back to that in a minute. But this is a brachiocephalic trunk. If you get the heart models, you'll see it's really stubby. It's the first branch off that aortic arch. Second branch coming off the aortic arch, running upward toward the neck, that's the left common carotid artery. So you see it kind of coursing up that way. And then the third branch here actually comes up and it actually turns and runs out to the left upper extremity. This is the left subclavian artery. Now there are a number of different ways you can try and keep these together. If you can remember that they all come off that arch of the aorta, keep them in alphabetical order for the most part. Brachiocephalic trunk, that's the B. Obviously left, but you just have to remember left. But then you have left common carotid, there's your C, common carotid, and then the S, subclavian. So there are other ways. I usually use BCS because it was, if you watch football, whatever bowl championship series, that was something. But brachiocephalic trunk, left common carotid artery, left subclavian artery. Those are the 3 branches off the arch of the aorta. Now, we're going to deal with the subclavian vessels first because the pattern is consistent regardless of which side you look on. You just have to get the pattern down. And it's all about anatomical terminology. Name for the happens is as the subclavian comes out, away from the left at least, from the aorta, you're going to be up underneath the clavicle about right through here. That would be right about where the collarbone is. See, there's the scapula, at least part of it. There's the humerus, which would make the shoulder joint. So just before you hit your shoulder joint, you would be up underneath your clavicle, subclavian, all right? The next vessel that left subclavian turns into is going to be the left axillary. Axillary, anybody remember what that represents or what that anatomical term relates to? Armpit. So if you look, where's your armpit? It's at the under area of the shoulder joint. So where your humerus, bless you, meets up with your scapula, right up underneath there, this is your axillary artery right here in the joint, okay? Next up, that area along the upper portion of the arm is brachial. So then you get to your brachial artery along the medial shaft there of the humerus. Notice we're not doing anything but naming this off of anatomical terms. Subclavian, below the clavicle. Axillary, in the armpit. Brachial, it's in the brachial region. We come down into the forearm area, you had 2 bones, right? You had the radius and also the ulnar. So now we're going to have a radial and also an ulnar artery, left if we're doing the sides. You just got to remember which bone is where. Remember, on the thumb side, that's going to be your radius, and on the pinky side, that's the ulnar. So here we find on the model, the thumb side, here's our radial artery, and then we come over here, there's the ulnar artery there. Artery in between is something you don't need to know. I'm not even going to go into that one. It's called an interosseous artery. Don't worry about it, okay? You don't have to identify it. But radial and ulnar arteries, okay? As you move down toward the hand, you're going to see a couple of palmar arches. Palmar, obviously palm, arch. There's a superficial and also a deep palmar arch. If you look here and also here, there they are, superficial and deeper. Deeper's a little bit lower, all right? superficial, and deep palmar arch. It mentions digital arteries. Honestly, on the handout, I believe it's a cut and paste job. We used to show the arm models, if you remember those from your days in A&P1 with the muscles. And if you look, the fingers, there's really small arteries running along the fingers. Those would be digital arteries. But at the end of the day, there's no vessel in that sequence that we've done so far that's not related to the anatomical terminology. Left subclavian, left axillary. Remember, look for that joint, under the joint. That's where I would tag it. Brachial, left brachial artery, left radial, left ulnar artery, superficial palmar arch, left deep palmar arch. Like I said, you want to see digital arteries on here, okay? All right, we pop back over here to the right side. The pattern is the same, but this is why we have to emphasize what side. The branch points are different. Remember, I never said anything about a right subclavian yet, all right? I only said that you have a brachiocephalic trunk. What that brachiocephalic trunk does is give rise to a right subclavian artery. And after that, the pattern is basically the exact same as what you saw on the left side. It's just that the right subclavian artery does not come directly off the aorta. It's because the aorta loops off to the left-hand side of the body. The brachiocephalic trunk is a way to get that same pattern on the right side. You just can't have the aorta do it. So here's that brachiocephalic trunk once again. If you look right about up underneath this point here, notice how there's a split, goes up, and then it continues out here to the right. This is your right subclavian artery. Follow that. There's a joint right here. There's your right axillary. Comes right brachial. And this arm is pronated. I wouldn't ask you to deal with this necessarily on here, but here's the radial, right radial, and there's the right ulnar artery. But like I said, see, pronate means it's cupped down, all right? So that means that the pattern is reversed. Notice over here, the radial was on the lateral side, the ulnar is on the median side. That's true. It's going to be that way, but when you pronate, turn your arm over, it reverses, okay? So notice the ulnar is now medial and the radial is now, the radial is now medial and the ulnar is now lateral, all right? So that's the upper extremity. Like I said, if you know your anatomical terms, now let's talk about those common carotids. Got to emphasize the fact that you got to name these correctly. Common carotid, because you're about to also see there's an internal, also an external carotid artery. So that prefix becomes important. Once again, you got to have the prefix. So don't just write carotid artery. That happens a lot. All right, common, external, internal carotid artery. Got to have one of those in front. Once again, there's our brachiocephalic trunk here. We have the right subclavian artery coming off, going into the right upper extremity. Now we have the right common carotid artery continuing up through the neck. Here's the left common carotid artery. We can't track that any further up, so I can only show you the left common carotid going up with there. The branching pattern, once again, is the same. Both common carotid arteries, regardless of which side you're on, are going to branch and give you an internal carotid artery and also an external carotid artery on that side. The internal carotid arteries go into the skull, hence the internal part to their name. They're going to become a series of various vessels that compose something called the cerebral arterial circle. I'm not going to show you that. It's not on the model. It is on the brain model if you took a look at that or, kind of saw that in the handout earlier. But we can track the external carotid artery. The external carotid arteries stay external to the surface of the skull, and they're going to give rise to several vessels that appear on top of the skull. So we follow the common carotid artery on up. If you look about right here, notice there is a branch, a little bit of a separation right there. There's the internal going inside. We can't track that. It goes into the carotid foramen. Maybe you remember that from A&P1 times. That's where the internal carotid arteries are entering the cranial cavity. But there's the external carotid artery right here. And you can see it continues on to the surface of the skull. It's going to give rise to three major vessel types that you guys need to be familiar with. And honestly, they're all named based upon anatomical terminology. There's the facial artery, which goes across the face. There's the superficial temporal artery, or sometimes we can also just call it temporal artery, which would be along the temporal aspect of the skull. And then there's the occipital artery. Occipital is back of the head, so you will see the occipital artery go along to the back of the skull. Once again, like I said, all anatomical terminology, at least for the most part. The whole carotid deal, obviously not, but anatomical terms for everybody else. All right. Since we are kind of up here, I want to start to mention at least some of the veins. I'd be remiss, obviously, if I didn't do that. The veins are a little bit of a unique situation, to put it lightly. Venous patterns are not consistent from person to person. There's a great deal of variability. In other words, certain veins that are in one location and you are not going to be in the same location as another individual. And even sometimes in the models, they reflect that. There's probability, but not consistency, if you understand what I'm saying. It's probable that this is here, but it ain't always going to be the case. So we kind of start by taking a look at the jugular veins here, all right? And the larger of the jugular veins is actually the internal jugular vein, because the way this happens, the internal jugular vein comes down, and usually there's also an external jugular vein. The external jugular vein drains everything from the surface of the skull. The internal jugular vein is basically the venous drainage for your brain, anything inside of the cranial cavity. In a lot of cases, they eventually merge, and only the internal jugular vein continues. But you see here in this pattern, the external and the internal never actually merge. It's just one of those inconsistencies. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. We don't know until we look at you specifically. But you got an internal and also an external jugular vein here. On the sagittal head, it's usually a little bit easier